calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years.
Russian military planes could soon be flying closer to the United States. Russia's defense minister says the country will expand military air patrols farther from its borders. The areas include the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. Russia says it's for training exercises. A Pentagon official says Russia needs to conduct those operations safely.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, these are quite dramatic announcements, aren't they, coming from Moscow, that Russia will resume Cold War-era flights across the Arctic from its bases there towards Alaska, and more flights down the west coast of the western Atlantic, down the east coast, towards the Gulf of Mexico. It hasn't done these kinds of flights testing U.S. air defences since the end of the Cold War. They don't actually represent a military threat as such. In fact, think tanks that have been focusing on the upsurge in these kinds of flights in Europe, saying the biggest threat they represent is to civilian airliners. There's a possibility of a mid-air collision because these military flights from Russia often don't use their in-flight transponders, their locators, nor do they communicate with ground control and air traffic control. And so they represent a danger in that sense. But again, the whole idea that Russia is resuming these Cold War-era flights gives us a pretty good picture of just how bad the relationship has become between Russia and the West.
Take a look at these black dots that we're showing here. This report says 40 encounters between the Russians and other nations over the past 8 months have rattled nerves and raised tensions to a Cold War level. You mentioned that close call that Jim mentioned as well between a passenger jet and a Russian jet along in here. But there are many others from the Russians. This report says they staged a simulated bombing attack on a Danish island. A Russian jet made threatening maneuvers toward a U.S. reconnaissance plane, including showing that it was fully armed with missiles. Russian planes have buzzed ships. And they even, out in this area, practiced a cruise missile strike within range of New York, Washington, and Chicago. Jake?
A dangerous maneuver. A Russian jet fighter buzzes right in front of a U.S. Air Force surveillance plane, within about 100 feet of the nose. A move which U.S. officials said endangered the American crew. Another incident. A Russian military aircraft comes within 50 miles of the California coast, the closest in years. Get ready for more. Russia's defense minister says his military is about to send long-range bombers to patrol near American coastlines.
You're going to have bombers coming in this direction from Russia. You're certainly going to have longer-range bombers coming down this coast, almost certainly. And you're also going to have bombers coming down this coast, and he also mentioned in particular flying in the Gulf of Mexico. So we're talking about ringing the United States with the exception of the Canadian border.
The Russian planes likely won't fly inside U.S. airspace within 14 miles of the coasts, but U.S. officials call the action provocative and destabilizing. Russia's defense minister says it's a response to aggression near its border with Ukraine.
This is a rationalization by Russia, and in particular by President Putin, to strengthen his appeal with his nationalist base.
Russia's aggression playing out around the globe. A Scandinavian passenger jet nearly colliding with a Russian surveillance plane. One incident right out of a Tom Clancy novel. In waters near Stockholm, a mysterious underwater vessel makes an emergency call in Russian. It triggers the largest submarine hunt off Sweden since the Cold War. All these incidents have taken place since Russia invaded Crimea in February. More than 40 close military encounters in that period, according to one European report.
U.S. relations with Russia seem to be getting frostier by the day, and in an unprecedented move, the Russian military says it now plans to send strategic bombers on regular patrol in America's backyard.
Russian bomber patrols over the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico would be very significant, U.S. military officers say, something the Russians have never done before. During the Cold War, Soviet aircraft flew reconnaissance missions there, but never bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Once in 2008 and again in 2013, blackjack bombers flew to Nicaragua and Venezuela, but those were window dressing for visits by high-level Russian delegations. When the Russian defense minister announced the bomber patrols earlier this week, he linked them specifically to tensions over Ukraine, in effect saying, if you meddle in our backyard, we'll meddle in yours. U.S. military officers say the patrols would not pose a military threat, since the bombers and their refueling tankers could be tracked as they came down through Greenland and Iceland and across the Atlantic, leaving plenty of time to scramble jet fighters. A real attack by Russian bombers would most likely come over the North Pole, the shortest distance between the two countries.
We see forces that are capable of being nuclear that are being moved to Crimea. Whether they are or not, we do not know, but they do have the kind of equipment there that could support that mission if required.
The UN Security Council met for an emergency meeting Wednesday to address the situation in Ukraine. Officials warned that the area is on the verge of returning to serious fighting.
We are deeply concerned over the possibility of a return to full-scale fighting. Alternatively, the conflict may simmer in this way for months, with sporadic low-level battles marked by periods of increased hostilities and further casualties.
This is a rare view inside the fighting in eastern Ukraine. A gun battle at the airport in Donetsk. Then a rebel tank fires and destroys a Ukrainian military position. These are Ukrainian forces battling separatists armed and supported by Russia. And now more Russian heavy weapons are on the way. New images of Russian military vehicles and artillery rolling into Ukraine. Ukraine's president says his country has lost control of its eastern border.
The Ukrainian-Russian border, under independent monitoring, is repeatedly crossed by the Russian regular forces.
Now, those same Russian forces say NATO's supreme allied commander are firing at drones from the International Observer Mission.
Russia has moved tanks, troops, and equipment into Ukraine in recent days. The alliance's supreme commander, U.S. General Philip Breedlove, confirmed reports by international observers. He said, quote, "There is no question anymore that Russia's military is operating inside Ukraine."
What worries me the most, I have said before, is that we have a situation